A widower with 3 kids was turned away from every job in Steinbach that winter, every single one. The night he was denied the last position he'd applied for. The one he'd driven 40 minutes each way to interview for. Twice. The hiring manager's wife happened to stop by the office to drop off his forgotten lunch. She saw something through the window of the front door she wasn't supposed to see. It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a man being difficult. It wasn't a man making excuses. It was a man in a coat with a broken zipper, holding a folder of papers against his chest in the January cold, nodding slowly at whatever her husband was telling him through the barely open door. And behind him, in a 10-year-old Civic idling at the curb, 3 small faces pressed against the foggy glass. What she did next would cost her husband more than he expected, and give that man more than he thought he deserved. Owen Bertrand was 44 years old, and he had never once in his life asked for something he hadn't earned. He'd worked construction for 18 years. Framing houses in the summers, insulating them in the winters, the kind of work that turns a man's hands into something that looks like old leather and feels like it. He'd worked for the same company out of Winnipeg since he was 26. He knew that company the way a man knows a house he built with his own hands. He knew which foreman to call when a shipment was late. He knew which inspector came early and which one never showed up before 10. He knew that the coffee in the site trailer was always burned by 8:30 and that you had to get there by 7 if you wanted a cup that tasted like anything other than regret. He'd been laid off on a Tuesday in November, along with 11 other men, because the company had lost a contract and the owner had made the decision over a long weekend without telling anyone it was coming. 14 years of employment call. A Tuesday morning phone, that was it. Owen didn't fall apart. He had 3 reasons not to. His son Liam was 12 and had been doing his own homework without being reminded since he was 9. Not because he was a particularly studious child, but because he'd understood early that his father was carrying enough already, and he didn't want to add to the pile. Liam made his own lunch every morning. He set his own alarm. He never asked for anything that wasn't necessary, and when something was necessary, he asked once, quietly, and didn't repeat himself. His daughter Faye was 8. She was the one who'd inherited her mother's laugh. Loud and unself-conscious and slightly too large for small rooms. Since her mother died, she didn't use that laugh as often. But when she did, it filled whatever space she was in completely. And Owen would go very still when he heard it, the way a man goes still when he hears a song he thought he'd forgotten. And then there was Noah, 5 years old. The one who still asked questions Owen didn't know how to answer. Where does the sky end? Why do dogs have 4 legs and not 5? Why isn't Mama home yet? Owen answered everything he could, and for the ones he couldn't, he said, "I don't know, bud," and Noah accepted that the way he accepted most things, with a brief nod and then something else entirely. Denise, their mother, had died 22 months before the layoff. Brain aneurysm. A Tuesday. Owen had started to distrust Tuesdays entirely. She'd been 39 years old, and had been complaining of a headache that morning and had told Owen she'd make an appointment to see the doctor later that week. She never made the appointment. By the time Owen got home from work, she was already gone. The grief was something Owen had learned to live around, the way you learn to live around a piece of furniture that's too heavy to move. You just stop walking into it. You find different routes through the room. He'd held the household together by sheer mechanical repetition. Groceries on Saturdays. Laundry on Sundays. Library pickup every other Thursday because it kept Noah busy and didn't cost anything. He meal prepped on Sunday afternoons. Big pots of things that could be stretched across 4 or 5 days. He cut Faye's hair himself after watching the same YouTube tutorial 6 times. He repaired the washing machine with a $40 part and a wrench and a 3-hour video from a channel run by a retired appliance repairman in Saskatchewan. The house was a rental in Steinbach, Manitoba. 2 bedrooms, a basement that smelled like moisture and old carpet, a furnace that had to be coaxed on every morning in November like a reluctant witness. Owen had shared the larger bedroom with Liam and Noah. Faye had the smaller one. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and the landlord was a quiet man named Russell, who had never once been unreasonable about anything. Then Russell sold the property. The new owners were a numbered company out of Mississauga. Owen received the notice by email, which was the first thing that told him these were people who had never thought of this house as anything other than a cell in a spreadsheet. 90 days. Renovations planned. All units vacant by March 1. Owen read the email twice, sitting at the kitchen table while Fee colored at the other end and Noah ate crackers beside her, and Liam did math homework with a pencil he'd sharpened down to a stub. He closed the laptop, started dinner, said nothing. He searched for 2 months. Every listing in Steinbach and the surrounding area, every community board, every Facebook group, every word-of-mouth lead from the guys at the job site before there was a job site anymore. He called numbers he found on index cards pinned to laundromat bulletin boards. He filled out applications during his lunch breaks, which eventually stopped being lunch breaks because there was no job to take a break from. The number that followed him on every application, 3, number of dependents. 3, he watched landlords' faces do the calculation when he said it. 3 kids, single father, laid off. The math didn't work for them. He could see it happening in real time. The small recalibration behind their eyes, the way a person's expression shifts when they've already decided no, but haven't yet figured out what to say instead. The first landlord told him the unit was a poor fit for children. Owen thanked him and left. The second landlord said she was still waiting on references from a previous applicant. Owen had seen the listing marked available online that same morning. He didn't say so. He thanked her and left. The third landlord was a man named Douglas Fair, 56 years old, who owned a cluster of rental properties on the east side of Steinbach. Nothing extravagant. Working-class units, a little worn around the edges, the kind of places where the appliances were older than the tenants, and the carpets had been steam-cleaned so many times they'd started to lose color. Douglas had spoken to Owen on the phone for 9 minutes. Owen had told him everything: the layoff, the house sale, Denise. He'd been transparent because he'd learned that surprises, in this context, cost him more than honesty. Douglas had said, "Come by Thursday. I've got a 3-bedroom on Elmwood. Let's have a look." Those words, "let's have a look." Owen had replayed them on the drive home. He hadn't slept much since November, but that night he did, and he dreamed of a door with a deadbolt that opened from the inside. Thursday morning he dressed the kids carefully. Liam's good shirt, the blue one his grandmother had sent at Christmas. Faye's hair, brushed and tied back the way she liked, in 2 sections with the elastic bands that matched. Noah wore the only pair of jeans that didn't have a hole in the knee, and Owen had ironed them the night before, which was something he'd never done in his life before Denise died, and something he now did every week, because she had always ironed their clothes, and he'd told himself he would not let that stop. They arrived at 10 a.m. Douglas opened the door. He was a broad man, gray at the temples, the kind of person whose handshake you feel for a few seconds after it ends. His face was open, not unfriendly. He extended his hand to Owen. They shook, and then Douglas's gaze moved past Owen's shoulder. He counted. Owen watched him do it. Something shifted in Douglas's face. Not cruelty. Something that looked almost like a door closing behind a window. "I didn't realize," Douglas said. "I thought you said 2, 3, Owen said. He kept his voice level. "I said 3. Douglas rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the porch railing. "The thing is, 3 kids in a 3-bedroom is already pushing it liability-wise, and with your employment situation being what it is, Mr. Fair," Owen said. "I have 16 years of on-time rent payments. I have references from every place I've ever lived. I have a callback interview next week with Kleisen Transport. My kids are quiet. They're respectful. Liam shovels the walk without being asked." Douglas glanced at Liam, who was standing behind his father with his hands at his sides and his chin level, and the expression of someone who has learned to make themselves very small and very still in moments that matter. "I'm sorry," Douglas said. "I can't take the risk. You understand." Owen looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you for your time, sir," he said. He turned, took Noah's hand, touched Faye briefly on the shoulder, and walked back toward the car. Liam followed. He always followed, and he always stayed between his brother and the street. Douglas watched them go. 4 figures in the February cold, breath fogging in the air. The smallest one looking back over his shoulder at a house that would never be his. Douglas closed the door. Something in his chest settled in a way that didn't quite feel like relief. That evening, Owen sat in the parking lot of a Tim Hortons and made phone calls on a phone with a cracked screen he'd been meaning to get fixed since September. The family shelter in Steinbach was full, waitlist. He called his brother in Brandon. Voicemail. Called again. His brother picked up on the 3rd call, voice careful in the way voices get when they're about to say something the person saying it doesn't want to say. "You know I would, Owen. It's just, Marlene's mother is here until April, and we're all ready." Owen said it's fine. He said it the way a person says it when it isn't. His sister in Portage la Prairie didn't answer at all. He checked his wallet. The Kleisen callback was real, but it was also next week, and next week was not tonight, and tonight the temperature was going to drop to -22. He'd found a motel on the highway outside town. $59 a night for a standard room. For 4 people, the manager had quoted him $85. Owen had $140 left in his account before the next paycheck that wasn't coming because there was no next paycheck. He drove to the motel. Paid for 1 night, put the kids in the 1 bed, and took the chair by the windows himself. He sat in that chair until 2 a.m. with his phone on his knee, scrolling through listings that had no listings, making calculations that kept coming out the same wrong way. Faye woke up at some point and found him there. "Dad," she said. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart. Are you sleeping in the chair?" "I'm just thinking." She looked at him for a moment with her mother's eyes, which she'd inherited along with the laugh, and which Owen still sometimes couldn't look at directly without needing a moment. "You should sleep," she said, like she was the one who was 8 and he was the one who needed reminding. "I will," he said. She went back to the bed and pressed herself against her brother's, and Owens sat in the chair and did not sleep. Carol Fair was 51 years old, a former occupational therapist who had left the profession not by choice but by necessity when her own mother's care had required someone at home full-time for 3 years. And by the time her mother passed, she'd been out of the field long enough that re-entering felt like learning a language she'd once been fluent in and could now only half-read. She and Douglas had been married for 27 years, a steady marriage. Practical and affectionate in the way of people who have been through enough together that performance has become unnecessary. They had 1 son, Joel, who lived in Calgary and called on Sundays. They had also, between Joel and the Sunday calls, lost a pregnancy when Carol was 33, and another when she was 36, and those losses sat in the marriage the way certain furniture sits in a room. Not in the way, exactly, but present, unmovable, shaping the paths people take around them. Carol managed the administrative side of Douglas's rental properties. She handled the applications, the lease agreements, the maintenance requests, the filing. She was the one who'd spoken to Owen on the phone the week before Douglas had agreed to the Thursday showing. She was the one who had thought, listening to him, "This one's solid." She hadn't said that to Douglas. She'd just put the file on his desk with a note that said "worth meeting." That Thursday she'd had a dental appointment that ran long, and by the time she drove past the Elmwood property on her way back, it was nearly 10:30. She saw Douglas's truck in the driveway. She pulled over to drop off the travel mug he'd left on the counter that morning. She saw them through the front window, Douglas standing in the doorway, the man on the porch. Owen. From the file, she recognized the face from the photo on his driver's license he'd submitted with the application, and behind Owen, 3 children standing in a line in the February cold. The oldest one, a boy, standing very straight, hands at his sides. A girl with her hair in 2 sections holding herself still with effort. A small one, barely past toddler age, holding the older boy's sleeve with 1 fist. She saw Douglas's body language before she heard a word. She sat in the car for a moment after Douglas closed the door. Then she turned around and went home. She was still sitting at the kitchen table with her coat on when Douglas got back 45 minutes later. "Where'd you go?" he asked. "Dental," she said. "How'd the Elmwood showing go?" Douglas opened the fridge, looked inside it, closed it, passed on it. The Bertrands. He looked at her. "The applicant, Owen Bertrand," Carol said. 3 kids, single father, 14 years with the same employer before the layoff. Not one late payment in his entire rental history. "I read the file, Douglas." Douglas set his keys on the counter. 3 kids under one roof is. We have 3 empty bedrooms in this house. The kitchen was very quiet. Douglas looked at her. Carol looked back. 27 years of marriage, and she still had a way of making silence into something that required a response. "Carol, I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm stating a fact. We have 3 empty bedrooms and a man with 3 children who has nowhere to go." "We don't know that." "Then find out," she said. "Because I read that file. And I know what I read. And I know where a man ends up when he's been turned away by every landlord in the city in February." Douglas didn't say anything. He knew where, too. He just hadn't let himself think about it until Carol put it in those words, and now he couldn't think about anything else. He found Owen's number in the file. Owen picked up on the second ring, and Douglas could hear in those 2 seconds of ambient sound, before Owen said anything at all, that he was not in a house. The acoustics were wrong. Too spare. A room with nothing soft to absorb the sound. "Mr. Bertrand," Douglas said. "This is Douglas Fair. I showed you the Elmwood property this morning." A pause. "I remember. I'd like to offer you a place to stay," Douglas said. "Temporarily, while you get things sorted." Another pause. Longer. "Why?" Owen said. Not a question with an inflection, a word laid flat on a table waiting to see what else was put next to it. Douglas looked at Carol, who was watching him from across the kitchen with her hands folded and her face giving nothing away. "Because I was wrong this morning," Douglas said. "And my wife is better at this than I am." Owen was quiet for a moment. "We're at the Sunrise Motel on Highway 12, he said. "Room 7. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Douglas said. He was there in 17. Carol had turned on the heat in the spare rooms before Douglas left. She'd put fresh towels on the beds and pulled the extra blanket from the linen closet, the heavy one they used in deep January. She'd started soup. Chicken. The kind she made when Joel was sick as a child. From scratch, the broth first. Douglas came back with Owen and 3 children who walked into the house one at a time as if each one was waiting to see whether the person ahead of them was going to be allowed to stay. Faye went first. She stood in the front hallway and looked at the stairs and then at Carol and said, "Is your house old? Ours had a smell." Carol said, "It was built in 1987. Faye considered this. "That's pretty old." "It is," Carol agreed. Noah came in next. He walked to the middle of the living room and turned around once slowly, like he was assessing it. Then he sat down on the floor, not on the couch, the floor, and pressed his palms flat against the hardwood. Carol watched him. He looked up. "It's warm," he said. Carol's throat tightened in a way she hadn't expected. "The heat's been on all day," she said. Liam was last. He came in behind his father and stood 3 feet from the door with his boots still on, even after Owen had taken his off, even after Faye had already run to the window to look at the backyard. He stood there and scanned the room the way someone scans a room when they're not sure how long they're staying. He met Carol's eyes once, briefly, then looked away. Carol recognized what she was seeing. It was the look of someone who has learned that comfort is a loan, not a gift, and who is calculating whether this one is worth the risk of accepting. She went to the kitchen and finished the soup. Douglas had given Owen 30 days. He'd said it in the car on the way back from the motel, in a voice that suggested the number was final because Douglas Fair had a lifelong habit of attaching numbers to things in order to feel less exposed by them. 30 days. That's what I can offer. Then we see where you are. Owen had said, "I understand." He'd said it the way a man says it when he means it, not the way he says it when he's agreeing to make something stop. The first morning, Douglas came downstairs at 6 a.m. and the kitchen was already clean. Not in the way a guest cleans a kitchen after being told to. In the way a person cleans a kitchen who understands that the space belongs to someone else and wants to leave it better. The counter had been wiped down. The coffee was already made, the right amount, black, because Owen had watched Douglas make it that first evening, and remembered. The chairs had been pushed in. The dish rack was empty and dry. Owen was at the kitchen table with a notepad and his phone, going through job listings with the concentration of someone who has decided that this particular hour of the morning is for this particular task and has built a wall around it. He looked up when Douglas came in. "Good morning." Douglas nodded, poured the coffee Owen had made, stood at the counter and drank it. He didn't say thank you, but he noticed, and noticing, for Douglas Fair, was the beginning of something, even if he hadn't named it yet. On the third day, Liam asked Douglas if he could help bring the recycling bins back from the curb. Douglas said yes, mostly because it was a reasonable thing to ask, and he didn't have a good reason to say no. Liam carried both bins at once, one in each hand. They were large blue bins, and they came up to his chest. He walked them back to the side of the house without being told where to put them, just figured it out from where the marks were in the snow. "You do a lot around the house?" Douglas asked. "Since Mom died," Liam said. He said it plainly, the way he'd said everything, with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has learned that plain is more efficient than decorated. Douglas nodded. "She died 2 years ago," Liam said. Not information, exactly, clarification. The way a person clarifies something they've learned to say quickly to get ahead of the question. "I know," Douglas said. "Your dad told me." Liam looked at him. Something shifted slightly in his expression. It's not softening exactly, but adjusting, like a camera bringing something into focus. "Okay," he said, and went inside. On the fourth morning, Noah appeared at the breakfast table with something cupped in both hands. He'd been outside in the backyard, which Carol had told the children they were welcome to use, and he'd found something in the snow near the old cedar planter Carol kept against the fence. He came to Carol with his hands out. In them was a piece of pale blue sea glass, weathered smooth, the kind that turns up in prairie yards because someone in the house's history had a garden and someone in that garden had a collection. "I found it," Noah said. "It's the color of your door." Carol looked at the sea glass, looked at Noah. He had a smear of snow on his forehead from falling down, which she was now certain he'd done but hadn't mentioned because he didn't mention small physical things. "It is the color of the door," she said. "You can have it," he said, "if you want." Carol held out her hand. Noah placed the sea glass in it with both of his, carefully, the way a child presents something important. Carol turned to the window. She stood there for a moment, and Douglas, walking through the hallway, saw her shoulders and stopped. He didn't say anything, but the image followed him all day. Carol holding a piece of sea glass in a kitchen full of a family that wasn't theirs. Her shoulders doing what shoulders do when a person is trying very hard not to feel too much at once. On the sixth evening, Douglas found Owen in the driveway after dinner, standing in the cold without his jacket, staring at nothing. Douglas stood next to him. They were quiet for a moment. "Kleisen called back," Owen said. Douglas waited. "They went with someone internal." A pause. "Third one, this week." Douglas said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew, the way people who've been through their own kind of loss know, that sometimes the thing a person needs is not commentary. Just the presence of someone standing next to them in the cold. After a while, Owen said, "I'm not someone who quits. I can see that," Douglas said. "I just need something to open up." "It will," Douglas said. He didn't know that with any certainty. He said it the way you say certain things. Not as a prediction, but as a decision about what you're going to believe on behalf of someone else, because they can't afford to believe it themselves right now. Owen looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "For all of this." Douglas looked at the garage. "You want to see something?" He took Owen into the garage and showed him the project he'd been putting off for 3 years, a set of oak cabinet doors he'd been meaning to refinish, just sitting there in a stack against the wall. He handed Owen a sanding block. They worked side by side for an hour and a half, not talking, just sanding. It was, Douglas thought later, one of the better evenings he'd had in a long time. On the 9th night, Carol and Owen sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep. Douglas was out at a property on the other side of town, a burst pipe, the kind of thing that requires the kind of man Douglas was, one who could fix things at 9 p.m. without complaint. Carol made tea. She held her mug for a long time before she said anything. "We lost 2 pregnancies," she said. 33 and 36. The second one I'd already told Joel. He was 4. He asked about it for months after. Owen was quiet. "Douglas blamed himself for the second one," Carol said. "He has never once said that in words. But I know him. He'd pushed for us to try again after the first, and when the second happened, he turned inward in a way he's never quite turned back from. Built systems around himself, rules. Numbers. 30 days, liability, risk." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "He's not a cold man. He's a man who learned to protect himself with paperwork." Owen nodded slowly. "He's been kind," he said. "He has," Carol agreed. "He just needed reminding how." She paused. "He saw you on that porch and felt something he didn't want to feel, and he said no before the feeling could get any louder. That's what he does." She looked at her mug. "I've loved him for 27 years, and that's still the thing about him I have to work hardest with." Owen was quiet for a moment. "He came and got us," he said, "at the motel. He didn't have to." "No," Carol said. "He didn't." Another pause. "I think the hardest thing," Owen said quietly, "isn't the money or even the jobs. It's explaining to Liam why it keeps happening. He's 12. He knows what the numbers mean. He sits there and does the math, and he doesn't say anything to me because he's trying to protect me from it." Owen's jaw tightened slightly. "He's 12 years old, and he's trying to protect me." Carol looked at him. Her eyes were steady, wet at the corners. "He's going to be remarkable," she said. "He already is." Owen pressed his lips together and didn't speak for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally, "he is." The job came through on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into their stay. Not Kleisen. A site supervisor position with a residential builder in Grunthal, 40 minutes south, full-time, benefits starting at 90 days. One of the foremen had worked with Owen years before and had left a message that Owen almost hadn't listened to because by that point he'd trained himself to brace before pressing play. He sat in the kitchen after the call and didn't move for a while. Then he went to find Douglas. Douglas was in the backyard shoveling a path to the shed, which he did every few days with the quiet regularity of a man who finds order satisfying. "I got it," Owen said. Douglas stopped shoveling. "The Grunthal position," Owen said. "They want me Monday." Douglas leaned on the shovel. He looked at Owen in the way he'd been looking at Owen for 3 weeks now, differently than he had on that Thursday morning on the Elmwood porch. With something that had no word in the vocabulary Douglas Fair usually used, something that sat closer to what the younger version of him might have called care. "That's good," Douglas said. "That's everything," Owen said. Douglas nodded. He picked up the shovel again and cleared another section of path. Then he said, without turning around, "The Elmwood unit's still empty." Owen said nothing. "I'm going to have the carpets replaced in the next couple weeks," Douglas said. "If you want to come look at it again when that's done." Owen was quiet for a moment. "I'd like that," he said. The carpet went in on a Thursday. Douglas had it done in a neutral gray that was practical and clean, and nothing like the beige it replaced. And he'd also, without making any particular announcement about it, replaced the kitchen faucet that had been dripping since October and repaired the doorbell that had stopped working sometime before the previous tenants left. He didn't mention any of this to Owen. Owen noticed anyway. The deposit situation was addressed directly and without ceremony. Douglas sat down with Owen at the kitchen table one afternoon and put a sheet of paper between them that had numbers on it. First month, last month, a security figure that was 20% below what Douglas charged anyone else. "This is what I'm offering," Douglas said. Owen read it. "That's not market rate." "No," Douglas agreed. "Douglas, you sanded those cabinet doors for 2 hours," Douglas said. "I'm calling it even." Owen looked at him. "That's not what it was worth," Owen said. "No," Douglas said, "it was worth more. I owe you the difference." He picked up his pen. "Take the unit, Owen." Owen took the unit. They moved in on a Saturday in March. Carol organized the kitchen while Douglas carried boxes. Liam took over his and Noah's bedroom immediately, arranging it with the specific intentionality of someone for whom a room with defined and stable walls is a concept so new it's still being processed. Faye put her stuffed rabbit, a gray one missing one eye that she'd had since she was 2 and that had never, even once, been left behind anywhere, on the windowsill of the living room, facing the street. Noah ran between the rooms opening and closing the doors. The sound of a door opening was still novel enough to fascinate him. The fact that it opened into the same room each time, that it closed and the room was still there, that these were, as of today, facts about a place that had a name. Home. Liam stood in the middle of his bedroom and pressed his palm flat against the wall. He held it there. He turned around to check if anyone was watching. Owen was in the doorway. "This is ours," Liam said. "Yeah," Owen said. "Actually, ours, Owen said. Liam turned back to the wall. He kept his hand there for another moment. Then he went to unpack his clothes, folding everything slowly and precisely, as if speed might make it feel less permanent. The changes Douglas Fair made to his rental practices that spring were not announced and were not publicized. He simply stopped asking about the number of children on an application, as though it were a liability metric. He stopped doing the calculation. He started doing what Carol had suggested the winter before, sitting down with applicants and asking, "What's your situation? What do you need? What can you do? Let's see what we can figure out." He dropped the deposit requirements for single parents, introduced a payment option for first and last month's rent, repaired 2 units that had been sitting vacant because he hadn't found tenants who fit the profile he'd always rented to. Stable, childless, low maintenance, and instead found families who were none of those things but were, he discovered, considerably better neighbors than he'd expected. He knew each of them by first name by October. He showed up to fix things without waiting to be called. He stopped putting numbers on the duration of arrangements. He didn't speak publicly about Owen. He didn't need to. Steinbach was the size of a place where word travels on its own, and what traveled was simple. Douglas Fair's properties were places where families were taken seriously. Saturday mornings, Douglas and Owen worked on the cabinet doors. They finished them eventually, all 12, and Douglas installed them in the kitchen at Elmwood because they turned out to be the right dimensions. Owen helped with the installation and brought Liam, who handed tools and asked the kind of questions about woodworking that had real answers. And Douglas answered every one of them with more patience than he would have given himself credit for. Carol came on Sundays. She brought food. A cold-cut spread, biscuits, the particular apple crisp that Noah had identified after one taste as his favorite thing he'd ever eaten, which Carol had found flattering to a degree she hadn't expected. Noah met her at the door every week with the same level of enthusiasm that most people reserve for the return of a person who's been gone for a very long time. Faye called her by her first name, Carol, directly, without self-consciousness. Faye had decided that first week that Carol was the sort of person who preferred directness, and she was right, and Carol appreciated being read that clearly by an 8-year-old. Liam had taken longer. He'd circled Carol for weeks the way he circled everything he wasn't yet sure about, at distance, watching, recalibrating slowly. But in the way that certain things happen without a definable moment, at some point he stopped circling. He started arriving to dinner before he was called. He started asking Carol questions about occupational therapy, which surprised her until she remembered that the oldest children of single parents often think seriously about health care. He was 12 years old and already thinking about what it would mean to be useful in the world. They had refused to rent to Owen Bertrand because he had 3 kids, 3 children. That was the arithmetic. Too many, too loud, too much wear on the walls, too much liability, not enough margin. 3 small reasons why every door in Steinbach should stay closed. But those 3 children were also why Carol Fair had sat at her kitchen table with her coat still on, waiting for her husband to come home. They were why a man who'd spent 27 years building walls around himself, with paperwork and policy and careful, measured risk, had driven to a motel on a February night without knowing exactly why, only knowing that something in what his wife said had landed differently than he'd expected. 3 children didn't cost Douglas Fair anything he couldn't afford to give. They gave him back something he hadn't known until the night Noah pressed his palms to the warm hardwood floor and looked up and said it like a fact, like a thing that needed no elaboration, that he'd been missing. Warmth is not complicated. It does not require paperwork. It does not have a liability clause. It is the most ordinary thing a house can hold, and the thing that makes a house into something more than walls and a locked door. Douglas Fair had very good locks. He'd always had very good locks. It turned out what he needed was to stop using them.